Welcome back to Conceit. I'm Clayton Hester. Thanks for joining me again. I appreciate you all listening back in. I know that last week was quite the hook, I think, as far as I'm concerned anyway. Gary Wolfe, Dr. Gary Wolfe was a great guest to have on the show. He's a wealth of knowledge. Just a great conversation was had there, and I really enjoyed it. I think he enjoyed it as well. It was a good conversation about just an expanse of topics within religion and science fiction. Like we kind of talked about, it's kind of a niche topic, but at the same time, it's also a huge thing to go into because of the way that not only religion impacts philosophy, the rest of the history of ideas, it also correlates and really deeply goes into the different matters in the history of ideas as far as it pertains to medicine and literature and just the whole gamut of things. And of course, those matters then stem out into science fiction. We delve into the topic of science fiction as though it were this kind of nerdy area of knowledge. And yes, it is, but it's also become such an extremely popularized way too. I think that the era of the nerd is really here in that it is, pop culture. As things fragment, they also become more of a lens for perception of new ideas and new things. So that's really how it has kind of stemmed out into the broader culture as the ideas of the future are really being implemented. Also, in the technology that we create and the different things that as a culture we can look at as our future, as our kind of perception of the things to come, which is really interesting when you look at the ways in which the kind of cognition of the future has changed. Today there had, to date, the 2000s have been populated with so much dystopian and post-apocalyptic fiction, which is, kind of says something about the era we're living in, which, in terms of where we are, up to the coronavirus pandemic, it was a lot of a matter of a real opulence to the era we're living in. Things have reached a different height. Whereas you kind of look back in terms of comparing that to the Cold War perception of the future, they had this kind of view of the Jetsons, which the Jetsons are kind of meant to in some ways parody and make a cartoon out of the retro futuristic idea of the future. Although it's very neat. It's very there's a kitsch to it. That's really interesting to delve into when you're looking back at the Jetson-esque aspects of the past, retro futurism. And really today it's been consolidated in atom punk, which is a genre of its own, kind of aesthetically harkening back to those things, and also deriving the key motivator and impetus for its technological world, its technological setup from atomic energy, of course, hence the name. And so this era's negativity, I think, about the future, and also the historical optimism about the future, really meet interestingly in different things like Fallout as a video game series, which is also going to be turned into an Amazon Prime TV show. Kind of a bitter and tongue-in-cheek approach to it, in which this future did pan out, but ultimately collapsed because of atomic war, because of the ways in which humanity had reached a level of sophistication in its weaponry as well as its day-to-day life. But that also being said, delves into the topic at hand today, which in general is utopianism, but also how that intersects with religion. As you know, as I'm sure you know, everybody says it anytime they talk about utopias, is that utopia literally means nowhere, and derived from the Greek, and itself is meant to be a satire of sorts on the idea that perfection is something we're capable of. And so, of course, that last century optimism about the future, these gleaming crystal spires and togas, as I think that the trope is named according to the internet. Those aspects of it are kind of the pursuit at heart within some of the science fiction of the last century. We can talk enough about Star Trek, and I feel like I do. I talk quite enough about Star Trek, though this is not an exclusively Star Trek podcast. The aspects and ideas in play in there are that of a utopia, and which is one of the reasons why Roddenberry had a lot of rules for his future, in that this utopia of the future had to be somewhere where the crews weren't fighting amongst themselves. The dynamics of conflict didn't really come from character to character the way, in general, writers and writing advice folks, people who write books about writing, will generally tell you that's where you need to get your conflict from, is because of the humanity as it's an intrinsic aspect, because relatability is more in play with how you write based on conflict. And there's bound to be any number of conflict. I think if you went down into it in terms of where conflict arises on a day-to-day basis, it finds its way into daily life. And so one of the conflicts then is a segue of these utopias in the future, how it stands and where we head, is the kind of question of is science fiction in conflict with religion in these highly innovative futures, in these highly sophisticated futures, as it were. And so in comparison, when you kind of look at those utopian ideals, I compare it to Firefly a lot, because of the fact that Firefly is in many ways the inverse of Star Trek, because it has its captain, it's got its doctor, it's got its leading officers, etc. Instead of a counselor, one of our passengers, we won't go into the specifics of that there, but as it stands, the kind of interesting aspects of this difference, one thing is that one of the passengers is a preacher, a shepherd, as they are called, and the word pastor itself refers to shepherd as well. So it's just another term expounded in its own world building.
Generally speaking, I think that Firefly has a more real grasp of the way humanity, at its core, the main values and systems of human interaction are generally more true to life with the Firefly. But as a whole, Star Trek does not really offend in it, and as so much as the idea of basically being unrealistic for that sense. No, so the idea with the matter of Roddenberry and this idea of his future in which religion was something to be overcome, something that humanity was getting over. That seems like I talked briefly with Dr. Wolf about last week, like something that was something of the time. With John Lennon and Imagine, that still at some level resonates with people. Still resonates in terms of people having this idea that science fiction projects the future, a utopia, where there is no division, and religion is something that more divides than it does unify. But the entire construct and the entire center that is science fiction, as far as philosophical fiction tends to go, science fiction would tend to go more towards the idea of being the thought experiment, really, with regards to philosophy, with regards to religion, as opposed to fantasy, which would tend to be more allegorical, or at least kind of play around with ideas in a different way, in more of an abstracted way than science fiction would tend to basically approach them at the center. Not, of course, to detract from fantasy, as, we can all be fantasy fans here. This podcast is open and welcome to all genres, and is open and welcome to all conversations about all those genres. But as it were, the kind of idea of religion fading away is nothing really new. It's kind of like that Voltaire quote where he says, and I quote, 100 years from my day, there will not be a Bible in the earth except one that is looked upon by an antiquarian curiosity seeker. So that didn't quite come to pass the way Voltaire was thinking. Anyway, Voltaire, no friend to Christianity here. And this idea isn't really anything recent, anything new, as Voltaire would point out. But Auguste Comte also had his law of the three stages, wherein humanity had gone through a theological stage to begin with, that is, religious stage, where dogmatic principle was key. The metaphysical stage came next, more of an abstract one. Generally, I think that he would probably, as far as intellectual history, which really wasn't so much his thing, as I think it probably would have pointed out that the status of different ideas and relationships, as far as religion and philosophy and law, and religion and law, any of those different areas that you can kind of pinpoint, each one having its own study, the relationship is constantly in flux, and I think that intellectual history demonstrates that with pretty good clarity. But as far as the theological stage, I imagine it would have been for him the end of the medieval period or so, through Reformation era. Metaphysical stage for him was the Enlightenment, and that would be the successor. That would be stage 2, and then lastly is the positive stage, which I imagine he figured was in his own time period, his own era, as it stood, and basically being the future of things, as it were, because of his ideas about science being a positive form of knowledge, being key in how we understand the world, and really blockading that against a relationship with religion. Both religion and science fiction, and religion and science ask the same kinds of questions. That was something that came up again last week as well. But as it stands, the empirical value of science to Comte was going to be the thing that wins out in terms of understanding, as opposed to abstract doctrinal grounds of faith. So he was going to be seeing the world as basically with the scientific revolution, it's the era of the future being ushered in. Whereas you can see with other areas of the scientific revolution, religion and science really don't have a problem. Kepler, for instance, was very keen on thinking that his day and age was the day and age of understanding astronomy. God had placed the things there to be known for just the right time, and it was the time to be revealed. It was a time for inquiry and interest, and so he had no problem with those different things, coming to life, and certainly living within his own Christian worldview. So Comte would not be agreeable to that, but as it were, Kepler was basically looking for the natural law, wherein his ideas, these ideas of discovery could take place, could unfold in the world around him. And as we've mentioned before, he also wrote something of a proto-science fiction work, which is no doubt a real interesting one, to be sure, involving some witches, a trip to the moon or so, things along those lines. But, just run-of-the-mill stuff. One of the individuals who really kind of tried to systematize history into a point where you could actually understand to a certain degree that there was a science to it. And of course, this is an area of debate in terms of whether history is a social science or humanities. It certainly is rooted in more of humanities when you look at the Greek historians, who vary in terms of their approach to the more dramatic or tragic. But they certainly are more of a humanities area. History, as it were, as it is, has shifted more to an analytic and scientific approach in today's world, certainly thanks to the Enlightenment. And so Hegel kind of charted his ideal of thesis and antithesis and the resulting synthesis, which is an idea that plays out in a lot of fiction, and it's toyed with in a number of places. But in terms of science fiction, and in terms of something like Roddenberry's future vision and those that are like it, the ideals are there. As far as the future history goes, as the Federation, it comes directly after such a traumatic and huge war that it's the remaining Earth population unites, and this leads to unity and progress in science and in traveling into space. So that's a fascinating aspect of it too, to see this synthesis. On the one hand, I don't know how you could best characterize this fictional future history as being particularly nationalist, because there were these various factions that had kind of risen in those days that really played into this war. But the outcome would be a globalist, globalization, to be sure, a unity among the different remaining individuals in this world as it stands. And so as far as that goes, you can see that kind of resulting synthesis, the remaining interests coming together, and so I think that with that, Roddenberry's ideals of having an irreligious future never quite gelled with the expectations of other writers in Star Trek, for instance. There are mentions made in Enterprise, which is that hotly contested prequel series, if you want to call it hotly contested, it was just scrutinized, probably might be a better word for it. The mention made of these different religious organizations, religious institutions with Phlox having basically dabbled in each of them after traveling to Earth, and visiting and inquiring into each of these different religious systems. So the idea of religion never really fades from Star Trek. It certainly never goes away. But it does become kind of a playground for religious questions, religious ideals being kind of interviewed, as it were. There's that episode as well of where they visit that planet, which basically is a commentary on, and I have to question with regards to Star Trek's many parallel Earths. I guess my approximation of fantasy as being the more allegorical genre is not necessarily so, as sometimes Star Trek was a bit on the nose with regards to its analogies with Bread and Circuses, which features a planet where Rome never fell. They have the TV, and so their gladiatorial combat is now featured on live television. So you might understand, and you might be able to infer but they're kind of making a point of it in this, in regards to the combat that we currently have on TV and those sorts of things. Anyway, towards the end, and it's not made an issue out of, but it's a fascinating thing to mention. There are these followers of the sun that are mentioned throughout the entire episode, and that befriend the crew as they visit the planet. But they would say, well, what's up with this? Because Rome never had a sun cult. Well, I don't know if you could actually say that. You make of what you will, in terms of that. There was the whole matter of Sol Invictus, which I don't actually quite know enough to broker on this podcast. But in general, there were probably no grassroots sun worship factions and such. But the point being is that by the end they realized that they were talking about the sun with a S-O-N, and basically that this planet had Christ, and so. The line being that Caesar and Christ, or Caesar and Jesus, I forget exactly how it goes, but that the planet had them both. So that, as it stands, the question, of course, is that this recurrence in Star Trek, it's certainly not a negative approach or negative interaction with the ideals, this messianic figure. It basically interacts and kind of comes into question with why things are the way they are, how this happens, and how this plays out. But certainly not a truly negative interaction. But as far as going back to really examining the idea of a secular utopia, if it is the way in which this planet, the future is best resolved to understand itself as being at odds with religion, as it were. That's a good question in terms of how in general, science fiction approaches this topic, and it approaches it in various ways. Science is a systematic inquiry into different matters, and as such, it kind of comes up with these epistemological questions. First of all, how does religion know what it knows, and basically, how far can you take this information and be able to represent it in a universal way? So as it stands, these questions do arise, and Star Trek ends up being the best example of this whole secular utopia experiment to kind of look into things to come that really examine and demonstrate where we are with the question of religion and science fiction and how things are going. So there's a dialectical concern as well, a dialectical interest as well to where we look at science fiction as this lens for understanding what's going on in the world today. And certainly we see others interacting in a different way. One more interesting book that I had come in contact with, and it's very little known, but it was Choice of Gods by Clifford Simak. Features, on the one hand, there's a lot of going on in this book, but on the one hand, one of the elements are these robots that painstakingly have dedication in a monkish style to the scriptures and to understanding the scriptures. And one of the things is how they understand and basically come to terms with these scriptures that they dedicate themselves to. What is the matter at hand, and how can it be basically applied to them as well? They pore over the scriptures and over the Bible, and it is a matter of great concern to them, and that is something odd for them to deal with, primarily because do they have souls? It's doubtful. Certainly from the Christian worldview of something that is manufactured or handcrafted or any other artificial sense to have a spirit. So these are kind of just basically I bring this up as an illustration of the ways in which our future certainly isn't really able to come clean of religion, if you want to basically consider it something to be cleaned of. But it is something where it's so deeply intertwined with us, so deeply at the heart of humanity. What does that mean for our future going forward? What does that mean for science fiction itself that would try to basically, kind of invert that, kind of express a utopianism where we're able to get over it, as I think that many of the utopian science fiction writers probably would express. And it's a curious matter at hand for the reasons of experiment in this area of thought. As Hegel was saying, or as Hegel had said, I guess, one of the matters is this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And so with a future where you have secularism, generally, Comte himself being responsible for the religion of humanity, which is basically a secular religion. It's basically his approach, or had been his approach, to maintain an ethical culture, to kind of basically do some level of social engineering. It was a matter of response, to have a social fabric in response to religion that still basically gave, sense of belonging, sense of purpose, sense of ethics, community, those different things that gave a reason and purpose and function to individuals in a religious sense, but secular. So as it were, the ideal of religion is still there, and so that you basically taking that to be the antithesis, or as it were, of the matter. And you see this as well because the French Revolution, for instance, was this rather remarkable thing in which, you probably know the history. However, the ideals of it, the intellectual history, is rather something else, wherein the church was persecuted during this revolution because of the idea that the church hierarchy, specifically the Roman Catholic Church, was suppressant of the normal people, as these estates were. The political and the religious were an enemy of the people, and so they figured a way that they needed some sort of social engineering to basically make this a good and useful way of basically helping the people out. And Robespierre was one who, taking a look at what the people had kind of instituted and remade cathedrals for the Temple of Reason, worshiping reason, represented in a feminine, statued form, basically having this goddess of reason, or epitome of reason. Basically, he considered it to produce way too much immorality, and so he instituted this religion of the Great Spirit. He instituted these ideals of this new church that would produce some sort of engineering. And so you see also, and the French Revolution is generally talked about as something where it's a good example of Hegel's thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But with this specific example, it's not as much of a matter of political as it is as a religious and social aspect, because of the ways in which basically the thesis in this case was the Roman Catholic Church. The antithesis was the Temple of Reason, then, or this revolutionary secularism, and the synthesis would have been Robespierre's temple of this spirit, basically a human spirit that basically was the driving, animating force of freedom and any number of things, as it were. So that really approximate and approaches what we're kind of looking at, and that's really demonstrated well in the work of Aldous Huxley, writing Brave New World. He demonstrates basically secular religion in a similar way to this idea of this universal spirit, as that is a part of the rituals of this people of the future. Basically they try to sanitize the past. One of the well-known quotes is that they had taken off the tops of the crosses on the church buildings in order to make them T's, because they have this veneration for an extremely deified Henry Ford. They basically ahistoricalize him and make him into this great innovator who basically led the way to the future. And so that is the grounds for their worship of him as this leader, as this social and technological engineer. And so they do have this engineered religion for themselves. They have this ideal of a world that they are all a part of as citizens, and have this worship, but not necessarily in the same religious veneration. It's a very, very secular worship, but still they pay homage to him. They take his name in vain. They say "O Ford" instead of "O Lord." It is basically a synthesis in that it is a stand-in for religion as a means of social engineering. One of the things that you look at with this and these hypotheticals, because at the heart of it, what makes this all science fiction is the hypothetical nature, the social science fiction, if you will, in which we witness these attempts to basically help provide a framework and a social fabric to these individuals in this community, in this society. It's given a new way for them to basically interact and basically continue as members of the social fabric. Like Thomas Huxley, that great relative of Aldous Huxley, had said of the religion of humanity, like Comte, that it is Catholicism minus Christianity. And so that critique is basically, ritual without doctrine or theology or purpose. I guess it's basically how you have to lay it on the line. That's at the heart of it. And so that's what basically this matter of social engineering is. This matter of dictate to the individuals in the society. So, as it were, the odds are, and I think what we are really looking at here is not whether Star Trek is a secular utopia or the Federation is a secular utopia. As it most certainly, the Federation is not. United Earth might be. The Federation is certainly not, because it is interacting with all of these different alien beings who have their own religious dictates, their own customs, their own background. But what is unique and what is different is United Earth, which may or may not still be religious, because of the fact we really haven't answered that question. We know what Roddenberry thought about it, but in terms of the fact it's a big world and lots of writers are playing around in it, and so we certainly know it didn't come easy for that point. But it's something where you would have to, if you will, exegete upon. You'd have to do some exegesis on some of the things that are said throughout the series in terms of the planet's own perception of the cosmos and their place in it, and whether they're these individuals have all collectively at once come of age in terms of understanding that it's better that they be secular. I don't know. That's generally just one man's vision for this particular universe, and so it is. Though he was the creator of it, it's still become a large and thriving thing outside of him, and the dynamics of the contemporary world certainly don't go out of play within the context of this particular world. And so that really wraps up the topic of today, and I really want to thank you all for listening, and I really want to also extend an offer to send me questions or topic ideas or any sort of input. I want to hear your feedback about the show. I love having you all listen, and I love having all of this information to talk about and to have this conversation. And on weeks when it's more of a conversation with you, the audience, and not so much about a guest, I still want to hear that conversation going, keep that dialectic going about these ideas at play in science fiction as we do this kind of survey into this specific niche topic that is still so very wide and so very dynamic. But overall, the podcast goes on in terms of speculative fiction, and we'd still love to hear you reach out with any ideas that you have in mind that we could talk about on this show, as I am very much open to talking about any of them and the interesting ways in which these genres and philosophy intersect, social science or humanities, other humanities, the ways in which intercontextuality works. Those different things and interactions are all at play in the show and in general in the world of fiction itself as we interact with it, and it shapes our society. All right, so for this episode, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. I'm Clayton Hester, encouraging you to read and to think and to listen in. This is Conceit, part of the Arrow Podcast Network.